The restaurant was a sanctuary of understated elegance, its amber lighting casting soft shadows across crisp white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The air carried the faint aroma of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary, mingling with the murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of wine glasses. Emily Harper sat at the small table near the window, her fingers tracing the stem of her water glass as she listened to her date, Mark, recount his latest entrepreneurial venture. The city skyline glittered beyond the glass, a mosaic of lights that felt distant, almost unreachable, much like the connection she'd hoped to find tonight. She'd agreed to this date on a whim, prodded by her friend Sir's relentless encouragement to put herself out there. But as Mark's voice droned on, his words a blur of buzzwords like disruption and scalability, Emily's enthusiasm waned. When the waiter had approached earlier, his pen poised over a notepad, she'd ordered only water, her appetite dulled by the growing certainty that this evening was a mistake. At the next table, a solitary figure sat in quiet contrast to the restaurant's lively hum. Charles Wentworth, a man in his early 60s, sipped a glass of Bordeaux, his silver hair catching the candlelight. His tailored navy suit spoke of wealth, but his posture slightly hunched, his gaze fixed on the wine's ruby depths hinted at a weariness that money couldn't erase. Charles was a millionaire several times over, his fortune built on a string of tech startups sold off in the dot-com boom. Now, his days were filled with board meetings and charity galas, but his evenings were often like this, alone in a crowded room, surrounded by strangers who saw only his wealth, not the man beneath it. He'd noticed Emily the moment she walked in, not for her appearance though her chestnut hair and simple black dress were striking but for the way her eyes flickered with a quiet resignation, a look he recognized all too well. Emily shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her glass as Mark launched into another story about the venture capitalist who'd almost invested in his app. His phone, resting face up on the table, buzzed intermittently, each vibration pulling his attention away from her. She'd met Mark through a dating app, one of those sleek platforms that promised compatibility based on algorithms she didn't trust. He'd seemed charming in their brief messages, his profile boasting a love for hiking and indie films. But in person, he was a whirlwind of self-promotion, his conversation a one-man show that left no room for her. She glanced around the restaurant, hoping for a distraction, and her eyes briefly met Charles's. His gaze was kind, unintrusive, and she offered a small, polite smile before looking away, embarrassed to have been caught staring. Charles, for his part, couldn't help but observe the scene unfolding at Emily's table. He'd seen countless couples in restaurants like this, their dynamics laid bare in fleeting glances and subtle gestures. Emily's date was oblivious, his voice carrying just enough to reveal his self-absorption. Charles noted the way Emily's shoulders slumped slightly, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth as if grounding herself in the absence of connection. He wondered what had brought her here, to this table with a man who seemed to see her as little more than an audience. There was a loneliness in her posture, a quiet take that mirrored his own, though hers felt fresher, less calcified by years of solitude. Charles had long ago accepted his isolation, a byproduct of a life spent chasing ambition only to find it hollow. But Emily, he sensed, was still fighting against hers, still hoping for something more. The waiter returned to Emily's table, his crisp white shirt a stark contrast to the restaurant's warm tones. "Are you sure you'd like nothing else, ma'am?" he asked, his tone gentle but professional. Emily shook her head, her voice barely audible. "Just water, thank you." The simplicity of her order struck Charles. It wasn't frugality, he thought, not in a place like this, where even the water came in a crystal carafe. It was a choice born of disinterest, a refusal to invest in a moment that felt empty. He watched as Mark ordered a steak, medium rare, and a glass of the house red, his voice loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Emily's water glass sat untouched, its surface rippling slightly as she nudged it with her fingertip. Mark's phone buzzed again, and he excused himself with a cursory, "Be right back," leaving Emily alone at the table. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly as if his absence was a relief. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window and the city beyond. The lights blurred in her vision, a kaleidoscope of possibility that felt out of reach. She was 32, a graphic designer with a modest apartment and a cat named Juniper who greeted her each evening with a plaintive meow. Her life was stable, her work fulfilling in its own way, but there was a hollowness she couldn't shake, a longing for connection that had led her to this restaurant, to this date, to this glass of water she didn't even want. Charles watched her from his table, his own meal, a pan-seared halibut untouched before him. He'd always been an observer, a skill honed in boardrooms where reading people meant the difference between a deal and a loss. But this was different. There was no agenda here, no strategy, just a woman who seemed as adrift as he felt, her quiet presence stirring something in him he hadn't felt in years, a desire to act, to reach out, however small the gesture. He signaled the waiter, a young man named Paolo who'd served him here before. "Paolo," Charles said softly, leaning in, "I'd like to send a dessert to the lady at table 12. Something special." "Your choice." Paolo's eyes flicked toward Emily's table, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "The lavender CRA tilde diaresis me bra la tilde copyright perhaps?" he suggested. Charles nodded, trusting the waiter's judgment. Moments later, Paolo approached Emily's table, setting down a delicate porcelain dish with a flourish. The CRA tilde diaresis me bra la tilde copyright gleamed under the candlelight, its caramelized crust a perfect golden brown, flecked with tiny lavender buds. Emily looked up, startled, her brows knitting in confusion. "Compliments of the gentleman," Paolo said, gesturing subtly toward Charles. Emily's gaze followed Paolo's gesture, landing on Charles. He raised his wine glass slightly, a gesture both warm and unassuming, as if to say, "No strings attached." Her cheeks flushed, and she hesitated, unsure how to respond. The dessert looked exquisite, its surface begging to be cracked, but she felt a flicker of unease. Why would a stranger do this? She glanced back at Charles, searching his face for motive, but found only a gentle smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. There was no expectation in his expression, no demand for acknowledgement, just kindness. She picked up her spoon, her movements tentative, and tapped the crust. The sharp crack was satisfying, a small rebellion against the evening's monotony. The first bite was a revelation, a silky custard, sweet with a hint of floral lavender, the crunch of caramel lingering on her tongue. For the first time that evening, she felt something akin to joy. She glanced at Charles again, her lips curving into a genuine smile. He nodded slightly, then turned his attention back to his wine, as if giving her space to enjoy the moment. Mark returned, sliding into his seat with a breezy apology. "Sorry about that, client stuff," he said, his eyes barely meeting hers. He didn't notice the dessert or the way Emily's expression had softened. He launched back into his monologue, this time about a competitor's app that was totally derivative. Emily nodded absently, her spoon dipping into the CRA tilde diaresis me bra la tilde copyright again. The dessert was a small anchor, grounding her in a moment that felt separate from Mark's endless chatter. She stole another glance at Charles, who was now gazing out the window, his profile etched against the city lights. There was a story in his solitude, she thought, a depth she couldn't quite grasp but felt drawn to. The evening wore on, Mark's voice blending into the restaurant's ambient hum. Emily finished the dessert, savoring its final bite, and set her spoon down with a quiet clink. She felt a pang of gratitude for the stranger's gesture, a small act that had shifted the night's trajectory. When the waiter brought the bill, Mark paid with a flourish, pulling out a sleek credit card and making a show of calculating the tip. He didn't ask about the dessert, and Emily didn't mention it. As they gathered their things to leave, she felt a pull to stay, to say something more to the man who'd noticed her in a way Mark hadn't. She lingered at the table, pretending to adjust her scarf, as Mark headed toward the door. Her eyes found Charles again. He was still there, alone, his wine glass now empty, his hands folded on the table. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and resolve, and approached his table. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "For the dessert. It was a broken bar, really kind of you." Charles looked up, his eyes warm and slightly surprised. "You look like you needed something sweet," he said simply, his voice low and unhurried. "I hope it helped."